Okay, welcome to the Radio Resistance podcast. Today we are joined by a special guest, Sarah Adams, who is a former CIA officer and targeting analyst. She's also the author of the book Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy, a Cold Case Investigation. Before I give a proper introduction or bio, I just wanted to say welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining today at the Radio Resistant podcast. Unfortunately, my co-host Kumel couldn't make it today, but I do look forward to a good discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We don't need him.
Yeah, no, I'm sure he's missing out, and he's gonna say it later, but we'll do fine. All right, so just to go over this bio really quick. Sarah Adams is an award-winning targeting officer and global threat advisor with extensive domestic and international experience. She's the chief operations officer of the Ukraine NGO Coordination Network. UNCN is an umbrella organization using a team of teams concept to bring together over 40 international NGOs to aid humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. With a career that has spanned the government, private, and non-profit sectors, she has worked overseas on behalf of the U.S. government's intelligence mission in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Most recently, she led the Department of Defense, the DoD, research and development efforts to discover, incubate, and deliver innovative solutions to complex national security challenges. Previously, she served as a senior advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives after being recruited as an executive appointment out of the CIA. She's also the author of Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy, a cold case open source investigation into the Al-Qaeda terrorists who attacked the U.S. consulate and CIA annex in Benghazi in 2012. She holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of San Diego and a bachelor's in international business from the University of Central Florida. So, quite a resume there. Former CIA officer. So, forgive me if I seem a little nervous today. It's not every day that I'm doing this. But yeah, Sarah, there's so much to talk about. But today we're going to be discussing, in general, Afghanistan. Just right off the bat, what are your feelings about the current situation? What has happened in the past, I guess, 2.5 years in the context of the 20 years that the war was going on there?
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, we call it in the US a moral injury, right? Because, we went over there, we fought for our government, right? But then we aligned obviously with Afghans, and then now we're impacted and hurt by obviously what is happening, right? So it's really affecting my generation, as you can imagine, because most of us, our whole adulthood, we have fought, right, in Afghanistan or been involved in Afghanistan, or our careers at least had touched in Afghanistan. I mean, even my Benghazi stuff, right? The Benghazi attacks were planned from the Pakistan-Afghanistan border region, right? Like everything ties back into it. And so we're so emotionally invested. And then, of course, all the people who served in Afghanistan have such close relations. And then I did evacuations from Afghanistan, still am. I mean, as you know, a lot of people are still stuck. So it's
Right.
just this ongoing almost pain, right, that we're experiencing, and we aren't feeling any reprieve. And then can you imagine then even how you guys feel and Afghans feel? And it's almost hard, right? Because like we can't complain almost how we're feeling because you guys have it a million times worse. It's like this broken system, and none of us can heal each other and make it better and move forward because it's just getting worse.
Right, right. No, that's a good way to put it. I definitely feel for you guys. Anyone that was invested in Afghanistan, all of our allies, there was so much work put in these past, in that 20 years that after following 9/11. Yeah, the outcome, how it ended was unfortunate. Of course, we're not going to sit here and just blame the Americans because the Americans were helping us, but we do have this feeling of resentment and bitterness, anger towards, I guess, the decision of the administration, specifically in how that withdrawal took place, how haphazardly, how sloppily, dangerously. It's just like the repercussions of it all, right? That we see today, because my entire, other than my immediate family, everyone is still living in Afghanistan right now, throughout a couple of provinces, and it's just life isn't the same for them. For people like us, like my mom, our family, we can't go back. It's just, Taliban, as you would know, they have lists. They're targeting people. So yeah, like you said, I know you said I can't imagine how it is for you guys, but we also understand what our allies are going through. All those veterans, all the intelligence officers, everyone that was truly, genuinely committed to fighting a real cause, that it was a mutual cause, which was combating terrorism. And that's actually the next thing that I do want to bring up, like a kind of general question, which is the concept of terrorism, specifically, I guess, fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. It's a real thing. There's no denying it. But I want to ask it from your point of view, because I know there are always people who will say things like, "Oh, it's these imperial powers, it's the occupiers that are the real terrorists," and it's when they say that, it's as if, so everyone else, all these other global terror groups, as if they're not real, as if all the damage that they've caused didn't happen, or as even worse, as if it's somehow justified. So is terrorism in this global Islamic terrorism, this jihad that they're waging, is how real is this? Please.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, there is this global jihad, right? And then there is this thought, whatever you want to call it, if it's the implementation of Sharia, if it's a caliphate, right? These Islamists want to enforce their view and their will on everyone, right? Which includes Muslims. And this is a part that gets disconnected with these people that say, oh, this is a fight against imperialism. The majority of people these terrorists kill are Muslims, right? I mean, I worked in Benghazi for years after our attacks. Our attackers went on to kill 20,000 Libyans, right, in Benghazi. So that's who's being impacted the most. So when people kind of downplay it as, oh no, this is some fight against, these big governments, they're ignoring all those people impacted, all the Muslims actually killed by these
Correct.
terrorists too. And that's something that really frustrates me because, as you can imagine, I mean, our investigation, right? We do it with the Muslims in Libya, right? It's the only
Yeah.
way we could be effective and hunt our terrorists down. These are our brothers, our partners. We love them, their family, right? And to watch people in their family, like I know men and every male in their family has been killed. And trying to explain that to people in the West or who have never been impacted by this, it's so hard, right? To get them to understand that. And it is a disconnect. People get stuck in kind of the Star Wars mentality and the resistance is the little guys, but that's not exactly how it translates in the real world. I mean, as you know, now being actual resistance, which is actually ridiculous, right? Like, you guys are the government. Like, the Taliban should be the ones running and having, like, stupid names. Like, the Afghans are the government. They run some fake thing on the side.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's definitely what I wanted to understand from you, that it's this disconnect from reality that people have, you know as if it all started only from 9/11, that there was nothing going on, during the 80s. There was no planning as bin Laden. It was all fake. One of the recent things that we saw in a couple of months ago was this TikTok trend, people glorifying bin Laden, sanitizing him, like it's unbelievable. And it's like, do you understand that at the attacks that were committed against civilians, and like you said, Muslims in Muslim countries, that of course then deserves, or needs a response. It's like, well, if you just ignore this and let it go, what's going to become of the world, right? These people will just expand and they'll grow, and we'll see no end to it. And anyway,
Well, I want to make one comment on like Bin
yes.
Laden's letter to America, because there's this misconception, and I would like to tell these TikTokers that was not written by Osama bin Laden. That was written by Adam Gadon, an American who knew how to write a letter to influence Americans. They need to understand that letter is purely to influence. That is not how bin Laden viewed it. That's how Adam Gadon said this will resonate. It didn't resonate then, but Adam Gadon was right. It resonated. And you guys are the fools that were convinced by what he said would resonate with you. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, have some better thoughts about this.
Right, right. And while we're still on this subject, which we'll be on for some time during this episode, but your experience in, I guess, the foreign countries, the Middle East, in South Asia, let's talk about that. I guess maybe if you want to quickly just discuss how you got into the agency and your experience in that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, really basically, I got into the agency like pretty much everybody probably does now. I applied online. My focus in grad school was the Kashmir region, which is of India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
So my focus area was so niche, right? It kind of limited my job opportunities, and so I applied to CIA so I could work Kashmir. It was that simple, and luckily I got in pretty quick, within that year. And so I graduated in 2006, and I started the CIA in 2006. So it was a pretty quick transition into the agency.
Wow. And then did you eventually get offered to get stationed in that part of the world? And where did the kind of counterterrorism or what was the title, targeter? Like when did this role come in, where you started to research and analyze and go after these terrorists?
Yeah, I mean, almost right away when I was hired, I was actually hired into the counterterrorism center to work in the Pakistan Afghanistan department. And then I was hired on paper as something called a political analyst. And basically, at my second week in the job, my boss has said, I'm going to make you this thing called the targeter. It's brand new. So I was pretty much a targeter or targeting analyst from like my second week in the agency. So that was pretty consistent too. Now, when you go overseas, there's two different things when you're in the CIA. You can go over as like a temporary duty assignment. So I did that plenty of times. You just go for like 1, 2, 3, 4 months, etc. Or you go for like a permanent, change of station. You go out for like an entire year. So you have those different things. You just apply to them while you're in the CIA, or someone asks you to come, which happens a lot with the short ones. And so I spent a lot of time overseas, kind of just filling those type of roles, and most of the time was to locate terrorists.
I see. In regards to, I guess, this going after, certain terrorists and collecting this intelligence, is there anyone currently in Afghanistan today, in the current scene, that you were, I guess, following back then?
Oh yeah, lots.
Really?
So as you can imagine, right? I mean, I work Pakistan, Afghanistan, so pretty much most terrorists I knew of, if they're not deceased, they are free right now. In
Uh-huh.
Afghanistan, it's almost like depressing to ask me that question, right? Um, so, I mean, a lot of people know one of my top targets was Mullah Berader. Obviously, he's free and alive. I spent a lot of time working like a Pakistani terrorist group called Lashkar-e Jhangvi, and they're
Yeah.
starting to kind of get active again because TTP is getting getting up there again, and of course Al-Qaeda uses both groups anyway. So there's just a lot of people moving around, and then the thing is, I have my Benghazi attackers. So the really interesting thing is, back when I was in CIA, we had a top 20 Al-Qaeda list and a top 10 Taliban list. And one of the terrorists on the top 20 the entire time I worked Pakistan, his name was Hamza al-Darnawi. He did our Benghazi attacks in 2012, and he relocated back to Afghanistan this last year. And so I am trying to track and locate him in Afghanistan. So I'm back in Afghanistan following a target that I followed early on in my years in the CIA. So yeah, it's all repetitive. You keep following the same people, and there's so many catches and releases that everybody's pretty much back out, it feels like.
Wow. Yeah, that kind of paints the picture, or shows this reality of the connections that these terror groups have, or like throughout the years. It's not like one guy just comes in and does something and he retires, or like he sticks in one part of the world. It seems like they just keep popping up and reconnecting throughout the years, throughout the decades, and in different regions with different groups. And I think I remember you mentioned in a previous podcast that during the assassination of the famous resistance leader in Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Massoud, that his assassination by Al Qaeda was somehow connected with Benghazi, which are a lead expert on. So what was that connection?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. So obviously, bin Laden and Zawahiri were very involved in that assassination. Zawahiri actually planned our attack in Benghazi. And for both of them, they used the Tunisian. His name is Saifullah Ben Hassin. So in 2012, during our attacks, he ran a group called Ansar al-Sharia al-Tunisia. And he provided terrorists to our attacks in 2012. And then he provided those two suicide bombers for the September 9th 2001 attack on Ahmad Shah Massoud. So, like you said, these historic relationships, they go back to the same people and provide the same attackers and terrorists. And we actually try to do a really good job in our Benghazi investigation to explain this, right? So we go all the way back, even to Sudan, to the Mujahideen era. We do the war in Algeria. We do Iraq, and then obviously we do Libya, Syria, etc. And we show over time when these terrorists cross paths. Obviously we focus a lot on Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri from Al-Qaeda just because he planned our attack, but it's really interesting. When he went to plan our attack, he went and contacted all these people from all those years, right, to pull them together for it. And a really interesting thing is Al-Qaeda in Libya reorganized around August of this last year. And they put like four pillars into place in this reorganization. And one pillar, its entire focus is reestablishing the Mujahideen relationships and supporting the old associates from the Mujahideen. That's one entire pillar of Al Qaeda in Libya. So, this is across the board. It's not just happening, these connections in Afghanistan. The whole community who fought back together are now like, hey, let's get back together. Let's support our brothers. A lot of them have been released after 20 years of detention. Like, we're going to be there and back them up.
Wow. Yeah, so these are the obviously the extremist elements that were part of, although they were a minority, part of the Mujahideen of the 80s, right, in Afghanistan.
Yeah, the really interesting part is Libyans went there and fought with actually a bunch of different groups. People don't really
Yeah.
understand that. So obviously, some fought with Al Qaeda, some fought with Hekmatyar, etc. And then the really interesting part is they weren't like other people. They came back to Libya and basically created their own group. So they had one that went there, the LIFG, which is a famous one. But one of the groups that came back and they started in 1996 was called the Martyrs Group. And they actually attacked us that night in Benghazi. So they were still in existence in 2012 and they still are. The guy who attacked us now runs the group, right? But he got his bona fides in Afghanistan, and then he came back and like took things he learned during the Mujahideen, but set up his own group. And Libyans do a lot of that. They make their own groups, but they still fall under these terrorists. And then the U.S. and other people play games, right? They're like, well, they're not really a terrorist group. They're not Al Qaeda on paper. It's like, no, they follow Al Qaeda. They just chose a different name because they like the identity of it.
Right, right. Okay, so I mean, you mentioned Zawahiri. I honestly didn't know that Zawahiri was behind Benghazi. Pretty much, that's news to me.
Yeah, he directed the attack and then he asked AQIM to carry it out. And it was actually a kidnapping operation of the
Yeah.
ambassador for then releases of some terrorists.
Right, right. Okay. That's crazy. I mean, for those who don't know, where Zawahiri was killed recently in, what was it, last 2022, right? In Afghanistan,
Probably, yep.
in Kabul, which is insane. What do you
And
think
his
about
brother
that?
just died on like around the Valentine's Day.
Oh,
Mohammed Al Zawahiri just died in Egyptian custody, and he was involved in our attacks too, and long supported his brother. And he was a really good connector, keeping his brother in touch with all the different Al Qaeda affiliates.
I see. But that's crazy that Zawahiri, who is such a you know lead figure, probably was obviously the top guy in Al Qaeda, which is the leading terror group probably after ISIS in recent years. That he see after the Taliban take over in 2021, this guy just shows up in Afghanistan. That couldn't be coincidence, right? There has to be some kind of, when we say that the Taliban are sheltering over, nearly 20 different terror groups, that's not, I don't think we're just bluffing, or that's not an exaggeration or anything. How much truth is there to that, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, my theory, I know everyone has theories. My theory is Zawahiri was basically always sheltered by the Haqqanis. So it's not surprising he ends up dead in a house in Kabul that seems to have some sort of ownership or relationship to the Haqqanis, right?
Right.
Basically, his time just ran up, right? Like, he thought they'll keep me safe. Kabul's safe for terrorists right now. He made a strategically wrong decision. Probably should have stayed in Waziristan or wherever he was. But yes, the Taliban is who has kept Zawahiri alive for all these years. Anyone who says otherwise is, just being dishonest.
Right. And the fact that Al Qaeda didn't really make a big deal out of his death, like there wasn't an announcement really, there wasn't like a type of mourning procession that they'll usually do on their propaganda websites or stuff like that. Isn't that odd? Like, why do you think that didn't happen?
Yeah, I had a lot of theories, and now I feel I know the answer. At first, I just thought, like, he's not dead, right? And then, like, people started saying Saif al-Adil's running, and then all my Libyans were like, no, like, none of us are falling under Saif al-Adil. And that's when I came up with the reasoning, oh, if they announce Zawahiri's dead, they have to announce the leader of Al-Qaeda. And the leader of Al-Qaeda is Hamza bin Laden, not Saif al-Adil. But EQ doesn't want anyone to know that. So just don't announce the death of Zawahiri, and you don't have to announce his replacement, and it keeps Hamza bin Laden safer for longer. And that's my theory now why
Right.
he hasn't been eulogized.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. And Hamza bin Laden is where currently?
I think he's kind of in the Kandahar area. He moves around.
He's in Afghanistan.
Of course, yes.
That's wild. This is crazy. So this is, I mean, this is pretty much what's happening right now, is kind of like we're seeing history repeat itself in a way. How right before 9/11, those years leading up to September 2001, Afghanistan was kind of ignored in a sense, right? That it was like, we're not going there, we're not doing any operations there, we're not really supporting any resistance there. And it was just like a free for all, a playground for terrorists. And of course, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because where would any terror group or any specific terrorist want to go? I think they would go take refuge in what is the only Islamic emirate, right? So they'll go there and they're going to have safe haven and shelter to coordinate, to plan, to train, right? And then eventually that is the narrative. That is what happened. And that's how 9/11 was planned and carried out from Afghanistan, from Al Qaeda being sheltered by the
Mhm.
Taliban there. Today, how is it any different now? I mean, isn't it kind of the same thing?
I think it's 100 times worse now, right? Because
God.
even during that time, Al Qaeda was in pockets, right? I mean, they're kind of down by Kandahar, right? And then they had like the Sarobi area in Kabul. Like they had small little pockets where they were training. And now there's 30 camps all around, right? 20% of them are suicide camps. They're growing. So Al Qaeda is so much bigger now than it was in 2001. And remember, I got to watch this in real time in Benghazi because after the
Mhm.
fall of, well, even before the fall of Gaddafi, bin Laden said, I want to create a base in Benghazi, right? And then they went and created a base in Benghazi. And honestly, they had a couple terrorist camps in Benghazi, maybe like a couple in the eastern city of Darna. I mean, it was like 5% of what is in Afghanistan. And like I said, with 5%, they kill probably 50,000 Libyans, right? Over the course of a decade. So now, if you multiply it by how many more times is in Afghanistan, it's 1,000 times worse. And one of the things people don't realize, it's not just the historic ties to Afghanistan. A lot of people went and fought there and stayed there. So we have
Yeah.
Libyans who went to Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, and then they married Afghan women.
Yeah.
They've been there 20 some years. So it's so easy for Libyans to go back in there, right? And like get brought back into Afghanistan. It's like they're almost going back to their old families and their old friends and those old connections. So it's like it's like this brotherhood. It's so hard to explain this terrorist brotherhood, but I think people miss it and they don't even understand it across groups, right? Because for Libya, for example, Al Qaeda and ISIS were the huge groups, right? And they ended up having the same enemy and they joined forces to take on that enemy. And then recently, they just arrested basically the guy running Al Qaeda and ISIS in Libya, and he was the same guy. And I think a lot of people are getting confused with these old brotherhoods. It's like, hey, ISIS and Al Qaeda work together if they need to, right? Taliban and Al Qaeda work together. Like, TTP and Al Qaeda work together. Like, stop putting them in their own buckets and stop saying, oh no, we're only targeting ISIS. It's like Al Qaeda's funding 20% of ISIS in Afghanistan, right? So we have to look at the terrorists in a different way and lump them in the same bucket because they don't look at it the way the West does.
Right, right, right. Wow, that's that's crazy that it's 10 times worse. I mean, it makes sense. I believe it. They just have free reign and nothing's being done about it. And this is to be honest, people, the anti-war crowd and those people watching this, like who isn't actually anti-war? I mean, nobody wants to go. War isn't. We're just going for fun and doing this, but the people who are against every, the pacifist types, this, with the selective outrage and things like that, they'll think that whenever we make these claims backed by legitimate evidence that there are these terror groups, and if nothing is done about it, then there will be an attack on the West. I feel like people don't understand this logic, that if you can take precautionary preemptive measures now, that would prevent a strike happening like 9/11, which would prevent a larger invasion and war that you are so direly against, right? That causes, when their main thing is, and rightfully so, there are cases of collateral damage, and civilians do take a toll in these wars. No one's justifying that, right? And if it's done intentionally, and or these people should be brought to justice, and if it's even if it's not done intentionally, if it was accidentally, there should be, there are still repercussions and reparations that should be, addressed. But what they're against is the idea of collateral damage, and then they'll also say that, oh, these are the real terrorists. But it's like, it's when it comes to the collateral damage that terrorists commit, it's like all of a sudden we ignore that or we justify
Mhm.
that, and their collateral damage is intentional. And it's Muslim against Muslim, so it's like that should be condemned a million times more. And they've killed arguably more Muslims, like in Afghanistan, the Taliban with Al Qaeda and ISIS and stuff, they've killed more Muslims than the errant airstrikes. But
Hmm.
it's like people want to ignore that. And if we continue defending terrorism and if people continue justifying and normalizing these terror groups, then eventually, I think people are getting too comfortable. I think people are getting too comfortable living in the West, bashing the West while normalizing terror groups. And then when the terror attack does happen, you know, they're gonna start screaming Islamophobia, and we're against this war. But it's like, well, we could have when the moderate Muslims and our allies were saying, let's handle this now so that day doesn't come. You all were against it. You're supporting this suicide bombing terror group that's ruling Afghanistan right now. That's sheltering dozens of terror groups.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and I mean, there's so many pieces to that, right?
yeah,
And it is the sympathy thing. I think one of the biggest sympathy things that gets lost is like these ISIS brides, right? The ISIS wives.
yeah,
Because the Western women can't picture, right? Oh, this blonde from Germany went met a terrorist, and like she couldn't have done bad things because she's like me. She looks like my neighbor. We
yeah,
need to bring her back, right? And they start like allowing someone like that to come, and then they allow someone else, and they get more. They do shorter prison sentences, right? And it
hmm,
becomes to where, yeah, it's like they're favoring the terrorists, and the terrorists get more rights than the victims, right? I mean, we see this a lot in these wives' trials. I mean, I don't know if you see Amal Clooney. She's run some really good cases against these women. And one of the wives was the wife of one of our 2012 Benghazi attackers. Sadly, like her and her husband, a couple years after Benghazi attacks, like a lot of our attackers moved to Syria. They got, unfortunately, a Yazidi woman. They would rape her and torture her, etc. And what happens is these terrorists go on to commit other crimes, right? Crimes against women is a huge one. Crimes against children is a major one. We had a Benghazi terrorist just detained 3 months ago for child rape. So another thing too is when you allow them to commit some crimes, they commit more crimes, right? And so that's another thing I think people get lost on because they're being empowered in these societies and even in some judicial systems. The British are a great example, right? The terrorists almost get more rights than they should get. And then they end up with a lot of them in their country, and that's like a ticking time bomb.
wow, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I will never understand that the type of sympathy that people have towards these are not normal people. Like terrorists are clearly mentally unstable. Regardless of what kind of trauma that they've seen, I mean, it doesn't justify what they're doing now. But anyway, I know I did express a lot of my. I'm kind of venting on here, even though you're our guest.
Oh, you're good. I vent all the time.
Okay, you mentioned Mullah Brother, right? Who are berater, as mentioned in different areas. Realizing that you know you were after this person when you were in Pakistan with the CIA, right? Did you would you say that you essentially the intel that you gathered and your mission in kind of capturing this person, did it lead to his actual capture? And when he was captured, can you describe that whole story and how it leads up to today? Because I have a
Yeah.
follow up question
I
to
mean,
that.
I feel like I'm getting this question because I love Afghans, but Afghans have a lot of rumors and a lot of gossip, right? So the funny part is I spent pretty much every day for 12 months looking for Mullah Berater, and I luckily found him only because his kids stole a phone out of his closet, right? Sometimes we get a terrorist, right? Because they just did something stupid.
Right.
So, but when I got Berater, as you can imagine, the rumors flew, right? So like maybe like a week later, like someone tried doing an ambush of the guy who owned the property Berater was in, for example. Like we knew where Berater was the night we captured him, right? This house, we didn't know where it was, but yeah, it was a Taliban member named like Mutasim or whatever. But yeah, they did like a drive-by shooting of this guy, And all these theories where he's a CIA source. I mean, maybe they still think that way of him. I don't know. I just remember that was like a really big one, as you can imagine. And then there
Yeah.
was like a really big one, like, oh, ISI, wanted Brader. And the funny part is, ISI wasn't even convinced when we said we're going to get Brader that was Brader, because the problem is there was a lot of attempts to get Brader, and they were all failures, right? So ISI is like, oh, they're just going to waste our time again and go after the wrong guy, and it's not going to be Brader. Like, they didn't take it super serious. So yeah, there was a lot of people saying, oh, Brader has enemies in the Taliban, and they set him up. I can promise you none of
Hmm.
Brader's enemies in the Taliban talk to me. But yeah, so
Yeah.
there was all these funny conspiracies, and they still
Yeah.
exist. And so yeah, I think them hearing that, yeah, we just tracked him like we would track a top 10 guy, and we got him like the CIA gets people, and it wasn't a conspiracy by his enemies or something. Yeah, they
No.
don't want to believe it.
I don't know why people. I mean, to me, it's I don't have those conspiracy or rumor ideas. It's just I see the irony that he was caught. What year was he caught, by the way?
Wait, it was what, January 2010?
2010.
Hmm.
And then, so what did they do with him? He was in U.S. custody in Pakistan, right? Or no?
No, he was in Pakistani custody the entire time. The U.S.
Of
doesn't
course.
hold, like, if Pakistan, if you do a capture, like, it's Pakistani custody, right? They're like a sovereign nation. We don't have like military bases in Pakistan where we hold bodies, if that makes sense. Like in Libya, if I captured a Libyan terrorist, he would go to Libyan custody, if that makes sense. It's the same type of thing. People get a little confused because Afghanistan, Iraq were these war zones, and there was things like
Yeah.
Bagram. But normal countries don't work that way, as you can imagine. If you pick up a terrorist in Saudi Arabia with the Saudis, he goes to Saudi custody, right? So you have to kind of look at it that way, not the war zone mentality of it.
Okay, but so Afghan, if it was in Afghanistan, that would be an exception because that is the war that is the
He
war
would
zone.
probably
That
go to a Bagram or whomever, right? Like, yeah, like a U.S. military base.
right. Okay, so he went to basically ISI custody,
Hmm.
and I assume they released him, right? Because what ended up happening? He
Yeah, I
started to get
believe it was after my time, but I believe it was some sort of deal for this reconciliation thing that then became the peace process, if that
the
makes sense.
Doha. Yeah, because he was a lead figure. Like you always saw his face there. He's always walking in Qatar with Khalil Zad and everyone else during this Doha deal. What
Yeah. So even when we caught him, at the time, there was a gentleman named Richard Holbrooke, and he was President Obama's like guy to make reconciliation happen. He probably had a real title, maybe like special envoy of some sort to
Mhm.
reconciliation. So he made the assessment, and it probably was with Zalmay, that Berater was the key for this reconciliation plan that State Department wanted. And so they kind of zeroed in and said, we're only doing reconciliation with Berater. And at least when I first met him, he wasn't interested. And then I guess over the years, they must have made some deal. We'll let you out, or we'll let your family live somewhere really nice like Doha and give you all these perks, and then pulled them in somehow. But yeah, that was a choice basically by the State Department and the U.S. government to make Mullah Berater the figurehead of the peace deal.
So this seems like it was all part of the plan, kind of like even during those years that like it was no longer this concept of we're fighting the Taliban and if we get one of their top guys, we're either going to lock him up until something actually comes out of that or we eliminate him. For those who may not know, Abdul Ghani Baradar, right, Mullah Baradar, who is known by Mullah Berater, he is currently the deputy prime minister, if I'm not mistaken, of Afghanistan, of the Taliban regime. He's like the top, pretty much the top guy, because you're not going to see, what's his name, freaking
Abatullah Gunzada.
yeah. Is this guy real, by the way? Just
Yeah, he
wow,
is. Well, it's really funny when
is he
I used
alive?
to, yeah, so I think he's alive, but when I used to look for my targets, he was running like this madrasa mosque kind of outside Quetta, and it was like a front, but it was really this suicide training camp. So I
Sheesh.
know him as this like oh, this horrible man who brings in these underprivileged kids and then makes them blow themselves up in Afghanistan, right? And then this government happens. They're like, he's some like religious scholar. I'm like, what? That's that jerk that ran those terrorist camps. So it's so funny too, this disconnect on Haibatullah. Like he's a really, 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 really bad guy, and he's very close to Al Qaeda, and that's something I don't think a lot of people know. Like he is 100% in bed all the time with Al Qaeda and spends a lot of time with them. So he is alive and very involved in Al Qaeda's external operations.
Wow. Yeah, Haybatullah Akhundzada, who is the supreme leader of the Taliban, basically the top guy. But the
Mhm.
crazy part is, of course, there are reports that he was killed in, what was it, 2017, I think, in a drone strike. Of course, I guess there's differing opinions on that. But regardless, he hasn't been seen or heard since the Taliban were handed over Afghanistan in August 2021. Like,
He's
how
been
does
seen. He's just not done like a public announcement, but he's been seen. Haibatula's 100% alive, I can assure
Yeah, but
you.
no, no, I could believe that, but like not seen in terms of like someone will say I saw him. Yeah, like the Taliban will say we saw him. He made an appearance. I remember they
Mhm.
said that. There was that one video where like they said it was him and he was on stage like with his back turned. It was such a joke. I think that was totally made up. But then no, he hasn't come out to show his face or to, even a voice recording. There was one that they said it's allegedly his voice, but if he is alive and, as you say, he's present, why is he not showing up like this mysterious figure? Why doesn't he show his face or say
Well, why
anything?
doesn't Hamza bin Laden show his face? They
But
live longer by not showing their faces, right? I mean, that's the way I look at it. I mean,
yeah,
remember Mullah Omar didn't show his face, and he basically kind of died of health issues, right? Like he wasn't taken out by a drone, or there wasn't
mm,
some secret Navy SEAL raid to get him. It's actually smarter to stay under the radar, and I think Al Qaeda's learning this, and other members of the government. Some people want to be involved, right? Some people wanted their Taliban government back, and they want to run it and show, yeah, we can keep the power on, and we're serious. Like Brader's one of those people, right? But Haibatullah never was super public, right? Like when he was even running his madrasa and stuff, like people didn't even know what he was doing, right? Like he
mm,
was always good at staying under the radar, and I think he's just that type of person.
okay. There's still going to be a lot of people who say he's fake and he doesn't exist and stuff like that. Does that matter if people think that? No, right? Because it's like, who cares?
I mean, he's the head of the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban's going to be gone in 5 years, so who cares? That's the way I look at it.
Okay, so that's an interesting point you brought up. The Taliban are. I'm going to quote you on this. You said it. You said it
Last
here on
time they
camera.
didn't make it 5 years. I mean, they're getting boosted up by all this international money. That's why they're still rolling. But hopefully, when we get that turned off, they're going to fail.
I think so too. Yeah, because they're pretty much on life support right now. It's like it increased from $40 million cash deposits
80,
per
and it's
week to
higher than that. When I figure out the number, I'm going to share
yeah.
it, but it's higher than 80 million every 10 days. 100%.
That's that's wild. That's
Hmm.
crazy. I mean, okay, so let me ask you another question since relating to that. Does this policy of that currently the Biden administration is taking of kind of, I don't know what you call it, appeasement or what towards the Taliban, this sending money that people they'll call aid, which is going to the central bank, which is owned by the Taliban, run by the
Hmm.
Taliban. They're literally propping up the Taliban with 80, $90 million every 10 days, like you said, keeping them on life support. And at the same time, they don't entertain even the thought of resistance against the Taliban. And the CIA seems to even possibly be like counter terrorism partners with the Taliban. This is Would this change? Do you think with the new administration, these policies by the I guess the president, State Department, however these differences are seen, the CIA. If you could touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, really, when you first said, I want to start in the first part when you talk about the Afghan central bank, because remember when you said,
Okay.
hey, who of your targets are still out there? So I used to work the guy who runs the Afghan central bank now, Gul Agha, right? Because he was Mullah Omar's right hand man. So I used to follow him trying to get to Mullah Omar. So we need to let everyone know the guy who runs the Afghan central bank was Mullah Omar's like closest confidant. So when the U.S. government says, "Oh, we give this money to the Afghan central bank and it doesn't go to the Taliban," it is 100% run by the Taliban. So that is like a lie off the top. I hope it's not going to go to another administration because we're funding terrorism at such an insane rate in Afghanistan that we can't wait for another president, right? So I'm hoping, we get the information out. We show the money that's supposed to be going to ISIS is going to Al Qaeda, going to international terrorism. We show that proof, right? And we force the US government to stop sending it because they are giving this money to sanction terrorists. It's illegal. It's material support to terrorism. I don't care if you say our policy is some sort of appeasement to the Taliban. We still do not fund terrorism. We still do not fund the bin Ladens. And I don't think they can get away with it, even if they stay under this administration. There's just too many people finding out about it. I feel they've been able to cover it up for so long because people weren't focused on it, but now we're all learning where these cash deliveries are going to,
Yeah.
who they're going to, the actual terrorist names, the actual terrorist groups. And it's more than Al Qaeda, it's more than the Taliban. They're even funding Kashmiri terrorist groups, which India is now going to get involved. So this is getting to be very, very dangerous, these US dollars going into Afghanistan.
Right, right. Speaking of, I know you mentioned Pakistan. The TTP have we've seen reports in the last year that they've been sending, fighters and their families, negotiating with the Taliban, sending them to northern regions of Afghanistan, settling in different areas. How much of a relationship do you think there is, from your analysis, working these groups between the TTP and the actual Taliban? So the Pakistani Taliban, and even though the Taliban are Pakistani essentially, but
Right. I mean, the way I look at it, right, is the region the TTP want is the same region the Afghan Taliban want to take into Afghanistan. So they're on the same side, if that makes sense. I mean,
Mhm.
they have historic relationships. Al Qaeda, though, is, I think, the biggest connector between the two, right? But they have the same priority. I don't really think tons and tons of TTP have actually moved. I know some families have, but TTP is better at staying where they are and then hoping for that this war that the Taliban keep teasing and Al Qaeda keep planning to do that for the Fatah, right? Because then the TTP is gonna kind of like get to keep where they are, right? Like I haven't heard the Taliban say we're gonna take over the TTP strongholds. I think they're going to work together and they need to work together against the Pak military for that. So I think they're only going to get closer. I think they only benefit from getting closer.
So that area, the Fatah area, specifically that tribal, what is it, federally administered,
Administer tribal areas.
between bordering Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. That's interesting. You know, since we do see these terrorists coming into Afghanistan from Pakistan as well, how much of a parallel do you see between that and, I guess, the people who are the migrant situation in the U.S.? I know it's. I guess there's nuance to it. I'm not going to simplify it and just say that all these the migrants are evil and we should just shut everything down. Although I do think it's getting out of hand. I live in New York and I see what's happening in the streets on a daily basis. These hotels are just packed with migrants. To the way some of these there's criminals coming out of them who are attacking police and just getting away with it and stuff like that. It's crazy, but when you do have like a pretty much open border in in the southern part of the United States, do you think there's a possibility that, because I know migrants from Afghanistan I know there. I definitely know that there are people who have traveled, to Brazil.
Mhm.
They get a visa to Brazil, and then they go through like the forest and stuff, and then they cross through Mexico, or the southern border. What can't there be terrorists coming from amongst those people?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing, so there's different things to look at, right? So
Mhm.
there's just an effort by it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Haqqanis to move terrorists to the southern border, right? So they do two different things. One is they say, yeah, go to Iran, go to Turkey, go to Qatar, see if Brazil will get you a visa, get in there, go up through the Darien Pass and get in, right? And then there's something a little more organized where they're issuing them documentation that says they're Afghan. So when you brought up the Pakistani example, so let's say, I don't know, a long time Pakistani terrorist comes to Afghanistan, they give him an Afghan passport. And then they offer him the same thing. Use your Afghan passport, try to go through a refugee pipeline if you can, because you get in more legitimately. You don't have to go in illegally, or just do the same thing, go to Brazil and come on up. So they're exploiting this in multiple ways. The thing I worry more about is all these terrorists are coming in the southern border, and then they get to the border. A lot of them drop their IDs, even if they had a fake ID, and then they go to someone and they say, "Oh, I'm Syrian. Oh, I'm Afghan." Afghans have some sympathy in the United States. They should, right? But
Yeah.
it might not be an Afghan. He could be an Iraqi. He could be a Syrian. He could be a Pakistani, right? And he might even have a document to say. The other thing we have to take into account, because Al Qaeda and the Taliban are making these documents, is they're also killing people. so so let's say you're like a commando, right? And they kidnapped you from your home, okay? Now no one knows what happened to you. And they've killed you, but nobody knows that, right? So you're just missing from Mazar Sharif. The Taliban know you're dead. So they can now go issue your documents to anybody and put you in that person's pipeline, right? Like
Yeah.
you, maybe he's on a pipeline to Germany, right? And now
Mhm.
that person's assumed their identity. Like there's a lot of different things that they've been smart. Like, let's take advantage of this. Let's try this, and then how they can manipulate biometrics, right? Because the Taliban can see, hey, at least when you were in this country, did the U.S. have your biometrics? Oh, good. I don't think they did, right? So you can travel easily. We don't even have to give you a fake identity, right? So they can actually pre-vet the terrorists they send. So there's so many things going on to where they can not just exploit the southern border, but the refugee pipelines, legitimate ones.
Right, right. Yeah, because even during that whole evacuation frenzy in 2021, I think there were reports, at least whether it was published in news agencies, but I know that there were reports of Taliban members getting in some of those planes, those
Oh yeah.
cargo planes and stuff like that. It's yeah.
They say up to 70,000 in the evac. We might not clearly have known who they are. And I actually have a
Jeez.
really interesting story. So, I worked evacs, right? And so the main family I brought out through the airport, the daughter was like, just a smart PhD student in Herat. And, the family got brought to Ramstein. And so she calls her brother from a cell phone. And I was like, how did she call you? And he's like, oh, she made this deal with this US Army officer, and he used her as his interpreter. And I said, in Ronstein, pretty much everybody should be interpreters. Why is he using this college student? And it
Right.
was because they could not find people who worked for the US government. Think of how scary that is. And then she was going person to person, and there were Afghan men who wouldn't look at her, very extreme people she was afraid of, right?
Mhm.
No association with the United States, and we brought them in the United States. Another situation I like to bring up is a good friend of mine was an air marshal, and they got on a plane from Ramstein over the Atlantic. They got a phone call saying, hey, there's a terrorist on your plane that had been in Afghanistan. And they said to him, you're more than halfway over the Atlantic just to land in the United States. So they also knew they took terrorists in too. So
Yeah.
it's a real mess. And once you get people in the United States, as you know, it's really hard to do deportation. I mean, even just to tracking and locating a person is almost impossible. It's not the movies, right? You don't know where these people are or what they're doing. So yeah, it should be very concerning to people. And the thing I like to tell people is we tried bringing our allies here. Besides leaving a ton of them behind, we brought them here, but then we brought their enemies here. And
Sure.
now that's a threat to them. Like
Sure.
they should be safe in America. That was the promise, right?
Yeah. So wow, that seems like, I mean, a potential recipe for a more coordinated means of attacking, right? Because I think it's inevitable that when was the last major terrorist attack that America faced, right? It's been a while, and I
Yeah,
think
and there was a lot that just didn't happen, right? Like Faisal
yeah,
Shahzad's thing didn't blow up, the underwear
yeah,
bombers thing didn't blow up, right? So there's a lot of incompetence too that saved us.
yeah, that's true. But it seems like it kind of feels like it's overdue, right? It seems like it's going, and I don't mean that in like a morbid or whatever type of way, but like it seems like it is overdue, and it's bound to happen, especially in the current political climate of the Muslim world, the polarization that we see
Hmm.
with what's going on in the Middle East, and the current the base that's in Afghanistan. People like we said, we just mentioned possible terrorist members coming in, and other terrorists planning and coordinating in Afghanistan. This whole all of these put together, if it seems like something is bound to happen, and I just think the U.S. is this current administration is being like complacent, and they're just not on they've let their guard down, I guess. And I think it's just a very dangerous and risky and just idiotic move to be partners with a terrorist regime that we've fought for 20 years. Anyway, last thing, I guess. So what we've seen currently in the last couple of days, I guess, UN members saying kind of nonsense regarding the Taliban, right? We saw Antonio Guterres of, you know, saying that they've improved in several different areas. It's like this general kind of whitewashing that we've
Hmm.
seen in the last 2.5 years, going from regional countries, right, to diplomats, right, Thomas West, to news outlets, even going as far as the UN, the EU, right? It's like statements that are essentially gaslighting Afghans and their allies, saying that like, no, no, it makes you question your sense of reality. Like, what is going on right now? Like, we are standing firm against this barbaric group, not just because their name is the Taliban, but like in the last 2.5 years, they haven't changed. They've gotten worse. It's like they're literally killing innocent people. There's gender apartheid. They have a suicide bombing unit. The amount of former, the interpreters or government employees and ANDSF, and just going after minority groups and stuff like that. They haven't changed one bit. And this policy of appeasement and this whitewashing and kind of effort to normalize them, even coming from members of the UN. What do you think about this as someone who's not from Afghanistan but was involved as an ally in this cause?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on forever about this. So I'll maybe
Yeah,
go on two topics.
sure.
The one is, when obviously the UN said, "Oh, they're making all this progress against the drug business, right?" Because they try to like, "Oh, poppy's down." It's like, no, but now the Taliban's doing meth with China, and then they're shipping it to the United States, and now we have a bigger meth problem because
Yeah.
China's doing with the Taliban. It's like they just switched to another drug. Don't lie to the
Right.
world and
Right.
say they fixed the drug problem. Another real problem is I do think the Haqqanis have more influence than a lot of people realize. And I think the State Department has made some strange assessments, which blows my mind that the Haqqanis now, they moved from Liberator, who was the moderate Taliban, and then they moved to Haibatullah for a bit. And now they've decided the Haqqanis are the moderate Taliban. And I think it's for convenience, okay? This is a Tom West problem, probably. So, what the West wants to do is they want to be done with Afghanistan. I know that's sad to say, but it's true. That's why the US pulled out the way it did. So, what they want to do, in my opinion, is they want to broker some crappy women's education plan with the Haqqani who runs the Department of Education, right? Obviously using Siraj and Badruddin and Anas, this is a little group here, little Kabbalah, and they want to give some crappy plan. I don't know, your girl goes to some junk school for 6 years and then you should be happy, and they're gonna make the women of Afghanistan just be happy with this, and then you're gonna be like, good, we gave you some women's
Yeah.
education, stop complaining, move on. So the way I kind of look at it is, you know we see what they're doing, right? I mean, I'm a woman. I prefer to talk to the women. Like,
Sure.
take the education off the table and now just say no. Like, until my flag flies over this country again, screw you. I'm making no deals with these terrorists. And that's what they're going to have to do, because the UN's going to try to make them settle. The US State Department's going to try to make them settle, whatever the Qatari government's involved in. They're going to make the Afghan people settle for these terrorists unless
Yeah.
they say no. There's no gray area, right?
Right.
We want all of our rights back, period. And we don't want the Taliban, period. And that's kind of has to be the stance of the Afghans, in my opinion, to get
That
over this political crap.
absolutely. That's perfect. The way you just put it, that's exactly. I think the same. That that the Taliban are specifically using women's education, the
Mhm.
girls' school issue, as like a bargaining chip,
Yep.
and and it seems like they're just waiting. They're trying to drag it out as long as they can, because when you one of the things is when you a conflict just drags out, eventually people start accepting it, or they just start giving
Settling.
up, they get
Yeah.
tired. Yeah, it's like you
You're
said,
in a
settling. That
trauma
was
relationship.
right. Trauma bond. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. I mean, and that's the worst thing, because then you've given up. And I think that's one thing where the Afghan community and our allies, I know it's hard, but we can't give up, because that's what they want. The
Hmm.
hope is like the strongest thing that we have. Not just the idea, not just a sense of hope, but like the effort through that hope that we make on a daily basis, our activism online, spreading the truth, and protesting, and just not giving in. Like when the UN, Antonio Guterres, what's his position again? I forget the name of it.
I think
Whatever,
he's
head
just
of the UN.
boss right now, like in the rotating position, like
Right.
whatever. Whatever he
Yeah.
does, he sucks at it.
Yeah, I forget his actual title. But anyway, when he says stuff like that, and you go in the comments section and you go through the quote
Mhm.
tweets, that's what we need. Like, it's like, no, your post has more comments against you and quote tweets against you than what you've said. That the Taliban haven't changed, that they don't deserve any type of praise for nothing. Like, right?
And
Yeah, so I think,
terrorists aren't diplomats. Oh, it
yeah,
drives me nuts. The diplomats are the women's the terrorists took these jobs from. Like, these terrorists
for
are not
real.
diplomats. Don't ever act like they are. If they get on planes, you should put them in prisons, period.
Yeah. Yeah. What happened to the travel bans against them? Like, that's all gone. It's like they've just, it's again, when you stretch it out for so long and people see the same thing over and over, like they just start accepting it. There's no more travel ban against them. They go everywhere they want. They're in diplomatic missions. Like diplomats are sitting with them taking photographs, which is nuts. And meanwhile, you have like this democratic moderate resistance group that shares all the common values with the U.S. and world allies. But it's like these guys, no, 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 we can't do that with them. We can't sit down with them. We can't entertain the idea of them being in the picture. It's crazy. But meanwhile, we invite the Taliban, and they don't even they you get stood up by them, which the other day they didn't even show up,
I know.
which I think that might have been strategic, to be honest.
Oh, they're playing games.
They're
And I
playing
don't
games.
really think the US population understands that the State Department and US policy is no support to the anti-Taliban resistance, which is insanity, right? Which
Yeah,
means we only support the terrorists in Afghanistan. Like I can't believe how my generation is okay with this and we don't
yeah,
hear more voices. I have so many friends who's they died or someone in their family died or they're missing limbs, and it's like, no, we're not supposed to be on the side of the Taliban, right? This is a lesson we were supposed to learn. Like,
yeah.
stop letting the State Department make the choice for the entire world on this. Like, they're wrong, period.
Yeah, and then you hear like these crazy kind of excuses come out there, like, oh well, it's because you guys aren't unified. There's too many of you guys to pick from, so therefore we had no choice. There's just too much democracy and women's rights, and there's too much of that, so we had to go with the most extreme misogynistic terrorist suicide bombing group there is instead. We had to. Like, where is the logic? Like Pete, this is what people need to be questioning. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
no, okay, if there is supposedly too many of the Democratic guys, well then pick one, pick the most popular one, and just give them a chance. Roll with them, sit down with them, and see what comes out of it. But
But what I do, I think the West, the people in America, I can
yeah,
tell you this just by sitting down with my friends, they do not understand the U.S. brokered a deal with the Taliban and excluded everyone else, right?
right,
This peace deal did not include the rest of
true,
anybody. It was a peace deal with a terrorist group. It's the most insane thing in the universe. And they broke every red line, even if you have a deal, right? They broke every red line, and then we still didn't end the deal. So yeah,
correct,
I just wish people would pay attention to what's going on. And as you know, it's not a unified thing. I do think the resistances should, I mean, obviously, I saw Libya. Libya had failures because the resistance was half good people and half terrorists, right?
yeah,
Obviously, we really don't have that problem as much in Afghanistan, but they were successful, right? Because they built this National Transitional Council, and that is what broker relationships with the West and brought in NATO, and they
sure,
shared the threat reporting coming out. Like, you know what I mean? They were this
yeah,
this this body that could do the politicking, and I do think the resistances have to probably have something like that. I mean, because people like me, right? We have our random relationships with here and there in the resistance, right? But it's hard to kind of know who to go to, who even with the Afghan people think, right? So I do think there has to be some sort of body, whatever that is, just because that's how the West looks at it. That's how the West wants a council or a consortium, right? That's just how
sure,
they view things, and that will probably have to be the way forward to advocate the reversal of the no support to the resistance, because obviously that's the key. We need to stop funding the Taliban, and we need to change the policy of no support to the anti-Taliban resistance. Those should be the two top priorities in the United States to change our Afghan policy.
no, 100%, and that's something I'm not going to sit here and defend the idea that we've been that we've been divided or anything like that. No, it's like one thing that we've been preaching is this idea of unity, like put the differences aside and unite. But I do think though that the resistance groups, they have made progress in uniting. I
Mm-hmm.
think some of the other players, to be honest, if they're not really doing anything and it's just all talk and they're just sitting in some other country or whatever, maybe you don't have to wait for them to say, like, no, we need all of you guys to unite. Just forget them. They're not doing anything anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Go look at the people who are currently on the ground in Afghanistan, eliminating Taliban
Mm-hmm.
and having the most popular and loud voices in the, I guess, political scene and on social media that just have that popularity. Like right now, there's no doubt, like when you talk about who's the resistance to the Taliban, the first name that comes up is Ahmad Massoud, right? The son of the national hero and the NRF. Like that's just a given. And I think personally, I do think that there is this bias against them, and yeah, but of course, other groups that are fighting, there should be a unified umbrella. It would be better, and politically, but I do think that also has happened. The Vienna process, we've seen, I think,
Mhm.
3 rounds of that so far, and that's from members from the former government, people who are in the actual NRF, and other other people, from religious members to civil society, all bunch of different women. So I think it's there. It's just we need to give it a shot. By we, I mean, of course, America. The two of us being Americans, but I don't know.
Yeah, and you have to remember, like, a lot of a fight, right, is putting the information out about the fight, right?
True.
Like you said, there's the hope piece for the people who are there, right? But like in the West, they got to hear this success is happening, right?
Yeah.
They need to hear, right, that maybe when the Taliban says they're killing ISIS guys, they're not killing ISIS guys, right? Like there needs to be, right, the central point that it's like, hey, when I hear from that, I know, that's like the resistance is like giving me the correct info, right? Like that's just such a big thing. And that's why it was so successful in Libya, right? Because people like,
Sure.
oh, it's coming out of there, right? Like these are the heroes of our country, right? Telling us the ground truth. And that really what like they became that, right? Even in
Yeah.
their own country, like it became almost like a nationalism, and everyone rallied around them, right? So
Yeah.
it's always you have to have that piece just to get, you know, interest, of course. And, like even coming together in meetings, if you're not like bringing in other people like to understand that, right, it's just it's so disconnected. Even this weird UN meeting, right, that just happened for
Yeah.
those 2 days, like what was really discussed? We hear some random points here and there, like who paid attention to it, like what was going on, who was really there, it's so like disconnected from reality that they didn't influence any of us. I don't think. I think they were hoping to,
No.
but you gotta influence is a real thing, right? I mean, sadly, but
True.
you have to get people on your side.
Hmm. Okay. We're getting close to, I guess, our time limit. Let's just to close this out. I just want to ask you one more thing. So what we just discussed, this it seems like this global conspiracy that's against Afghanistan. I hate that word, to be honest. I hate conspiracy
I
theories, and
hate
I'm
it too.
I'm not
We're right
about
from
that.
Benghazi. We don't like the word conspiracy.
Sorry. Okay.
I'm just
But
kidding.
you know what I mean in the context of Afghanistan. This like gaslighting and this, normalizing the Taliban, and completely ignoring the resistance, and the UN members and the head of the UN saying ridiculous claims every few days and stuff like that. So when this is all happening, one can't help but think, well, then what's the if the game is rigged, essentially. The game is rigged. What am I doing here? Just like there was a coach. I remember there was like the Raptors coach of the NBA. The other it was like a couple weeks ago, and he was like, the game seemed completely against him, right?
Mhm.
I think the
I
Lakers had like
recall.
like a bunch of fouls that they had got called for them, and meanwhile the Raptors got like nothing, and he was furious at post game interview. They lost by 1 point. He's like, what just happened here? He's like, this was insane. He gave the stats, and it was like, he's right. And he's like, listen, if this is planned out or whatever, I forgot how he said it. He's like, just let us know so we don't have to show up. So just let us know. Give them the win so we don't have to show up. Just let us know. So I can't help but sometimes, I'm sure there are people who think that if the game is rigged and the whole world and all these political entities are conspiring against the people of Afghanistan and supporting this terrorist group, then is what would you say that should people just give up, or do you keep is just how the game goes, and you you play the game until the ball is in your court? Like, what would you say?
Well, I got to watch this in real time, right? So
Yeah.
basically, Al Qaeda went in to create a headquarters in Benghazi, right? And Benghazi fell, right, to Al Qaeda and ISIS. And
Yeah.
one of the reasons they fell to Al Qaeda and ISIS, right, was because the UN, NATO, the US State Department backed the Al Qaeda aligned government of Libya, right? So the Benghazi people and the people in eastern Libya could have been like, oh, our whole lives we've been under someone's thumb, right? Gaddafi kept us down in the East forever. We're just used to this, right? We're used to being screwed, right? They could have done that. But in 2014, they're like, no, we're going to take it to the terrorists and we're going to eliminate them. And they eliminated all the terrorists basically in 3 years. So when people come together and they don't care about, they brought in some outside forces eventually. They lost 8,000 soldiers, and then, they had to make some deals with UAE, etc. And then unfortunately the Russians. But that was U.S. policy, um, bad U.S. policy. But anyway, the people said, screw it. I don't care what, these foreign governments, sure, they're funding Al Qaeda here, whatever, but we're going to take it to them and we're going to end them. And they did it. And they did it successfully. And I think that's what you need to focus on, right? The people who did it, and the people who did it and didn't care if the international community had an opinion one way or the other, because really they don't. This is your damn country. Take it back. That's the way they
Right.
handle it in Benghazi. And I think they can handle it that way in Afghanistan. It's a way bigger problem, but the sooner you deal with it, the better.
That's very well said. That's a good point. So basically, like if the game is rigged, who cares, right? If it's against you, the calls are against you, who cares? If you can outperform them, you could still win. And I
Yeah.
think that
Or
that
you could
happens.
sabotage him, like knock out the guy's leg and he can't play the rest of the game. Like, you
Yeah,
don't
there you
have
go.
to play clean. I'm sorry.
True.
You're playing against terrorists.
Yeah.
Don't let policymakers in another country that live in gated communities tell you how to take it to the enemy. Never. Like, don't do that.
Wow. Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I think that's what the resistance is saying. They're like, when they see some of these statements come out, they're like, listen, whether you support us or not, we're not going to stop. The
Right.
resistance continues. We're going to fight till we get our country back, till we eliminate these people and we kick them out.
Right.
So,
And
mhm,
Libya had that, right? They had a
yeah,
strong man, General Haftar, and he said, I love my country. I'm not letting it fall to terrorists. F you. Right? He gets sued all the time in the United States for war crimes. He don't give a damn because he loves his country. And that's just the way you got to do it, and screw the haters.
yeah. And if you do it right, then eventually you can sway. I feel like you can sway their policy, and they'll be like, you know what, this isn't working. Like these guys are outdoing us. Let's switch. Let's switch back and let's support these guys. I could see that happening. So okay. Anyway, I took enough of your time, Sarah. I appreciate you joining us. Everything that you've said, it's you can't get this anywhere else. So thank you, and I do hope that sometime in the future you'll join us again.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Until next time.
Bye.